Charmian Duce Knowles. As I said, when we were in England, the Mandali followed us over a little bit later than Bob and the rest of us on another plane from the East Coast. And when they arrived, Baba sent the Becketts down to meet them at the airport, and they missed him. So the entire morning afterwards was spent with the Mandali missing and Baba calling everybody in one after another. We're all sitting around in the room, and he'd say, well, it's all Delia's fault, or it's all Rano's fault, or it's all Charmian's fault, or it's Baba's will. I think Baba's fault, or Baba's God's will. This went on around the room and around the room, and over again Baba went through this routine. Finally, the Becketts arrived. And, of course, Baba really was upset by it. And we thought, oh, my, now the fireworks will really start. And instead of that, as soon as the Becketts came, Baba, being utterly unpredictable, called them in, had them each sit on either side of him on the bed, and immediately reached out and said, now, I want you all to know that these are my archangels. And I'm sure, very really, the Becketts were Baba's archangels to him. They were always full of love for Baba, and Baba loved them dearly. But it was just sort of funny, and of course we all sat there with our jaws dropped, saying, oh, no fireworks. A little while later we heard a noise out in the hallway about 1 o'clock, and the Mandali had finally turned up. Delia's brother had found them out in Kensington, brought them back to the hotel. And so we were wondering what was going to happen. Baba sent the girls out of the room, and then he sent all of us out. And the Mandali came in. Rano and Delia and I were standing around the corner with our ears hanging out, wondering what Baba was going to say, because he'd been very upset all morning long. And we stood there and we listened, and the door had shut behind them. And it was just Baba and the Mandali in the room, and we couldn't hear a sound, and it just seemed interminable. We waited and waited, and finally the door opened and the Mandali came out. They looked exactly like a bird that had gotten caught in a badminton game. Their heads were hung low and tears were coursing down their cheeks, and they literally looked like the world had just come to an end. And I mean, all we could think was that the worst catastrophe in the world had occurred. Bob had sent them all away permanently or something. And we were standing there and waiting with bated breath, and finally we couldn't bear it as they walked past us, and we all looked at each other, and then we all burst out, well, Sarosh, Adi, what's happened? And the Mandali looked at us and lifted their heads, and as I say, big tears coursed out of their eyes, and Baba says, it's all our fault. And they just were crying. Well, of course, we immediately rolled down on the floor. We laughed so hard that we were practically turning inside out. And the men looked at us like we had absolutely gone insane. Here they were in the depths of tribulation, and there we were laughing at them when they had just said that what to them was the worst thing in the world had occurred. So finally, when we pulled ourselves together, and they had gotten over their shock at our behavior, and we'd gotten over laughing, we told them what Baba had been doing all morning with us, and then they went off feeling very cheered up. But I had forgotten one story which occurred earlier when I first went over to India to see Baba. Baba always wanted people to be very flexible around him and quite adaptable. You had to be. Some days Baba would say, well, tonight we'll have dinner, and other nights he'd say, well, I don't think we'll have dinner tonight. So you ate when the food was there, and you didn't when the food wasn't. He always wanted people not to become fixed in their habits, not to get into a situation where they said, well, without this particular thing, I can't go on, or I can't function unless I have so-and-so. We shouldn't get attached to material things that way. It's fine to have them, have possessions, and have good habits, but one mustn't get so fixed in any habit that one can't let go of it. All my life, having been a good trencherman, unfortunately, as my figure shows, I had decided that I'd always eaten everything, and whatever was given to me, I ate. Well, there was only one thing I really didn't like, and that was eggs. And I think it was the result probably of arriving in too many airports at 5 a.m. and watching rather green-faced people with whiskery growth gathered under fluorescent lights and seeing great big platters of green eggs, because the old fluorescent lights used to make eggs look green, arrive in front of us, slightly warmed over. And no egg in any way, shape, or form could tempt me. Well, when I got to India the first day, 1947, I woke up in the morning, and we used to get up at 5 o'clock to have breakfast. And they came and knocked on our door and said, 5 o'clock, breakfast in half an hour. So I rolled over on my little bed, and I looked at Mershta, and I had been quite ill just before them in Cairo. And I said, well, couldn't I just sleep for a little while longer? So Mershta asked Goher, who had knocked on the door, and Goher said, well, I'll go ask Baba. Well, a little while later, knock, 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 and Goher was back, and she said, Baba says Charmian may sleep until 9 o'clock. I said, whew. And so she said, well, the only thing is that if Charmian will eat the breakfast that Baba sends her. Well, I was so glad to be able to sleep, I said, oh, fine, anything, yes. Promptly went to sleep. 9 o'clock, knock came on the door, and I hopped up and got dressed and went out and sat on the porch, and pretty soon I could see Kaka coming across, because he fixed all our food while we were there. And he had a tray, a beautiful tray, fresh fruit on it, and a bowl, something. I couldn't see it from that distance. Well, when it arrived, what it was a bowl with 2 eggs, which I swear, if they'd been walked through the water fast or run through it, why, that was the most of a touch they'd had. So I looked at these 2 raw eggs, and Mershta said later, well, she said she couldn't believe it, because I looked at Kaka quietly, and I didn't say anything. I just said, well, Kaka, would you maybe have a little vinegar or some salt or pepper or almost anything? And so Kaka came back with some vinegar and oil. And I tried dousing them with that, and I finally gave up. I mean, there was just no way for me to make those eggs go down any more smoothly. So I finally just picked up the bowl and drank them. And Mershta said she could hardly believe it, because for years I wouldn't touch eggs. Well, the rest of the story really is hers, because it's like the old limerick, my face, I don't mind it because I'm behind it, it's the people in front that I jar. And she was the observer to it, but about lunchtime, evidently, Kaka came around, and we were out talking on the porch with, I think, the girls. Or not the girls, it would have been Elizabeth and Narina, perhaps. And he went to her and asked if there was anything special she'd like for lunch, and she said, well, she wanted so-and-so. And then he came up to me and he asked me if I'd like something, and I looked up absent-mindedly and said, oh, I don't know, Kaka, maybe a couple of poached eggs. Mershta said, well, I don't believe what I'm hearing. Well, lunchtime came and went, and I had the poached eggs, and dinner time, Kaka again came up, evidently on Baba's orders, and asked what we would like for dinner, and Mershta said, I turned around rather distractedly and said, oh, Kaka, I don't know, maybe a couple of scrambled eggs would be good. And Mershta finally couldn't restrain herself any further and came over and grabbed me by the shoulder and kind of shook me and said, Charmian, do you know what you're saying? And from that day to this, I still eat eggs with a fair degree of equanimity. But Baba always knows what one's weakness is. And you can be sure if there's anything that you're really attached to and don't feel you can let go of, Baba will pick it out pretty quickly, and that's the thing he'll work on. And of course, this is very good for one. So as I say, Baba never let us get fixed in our habits or the things around us, and whatever our particular hang-up was along that line, he always used to try and help us with in one way. And sometimes it would be years later before we found out why he did something that he did. And even then, I'm sure there were other explanations too. One of those incidents occurred about the same time as this egg bit. It was during this first visit to India, and it's only been in recent years that I realized what the reason for it was. I was out in the garden with Mani talking one day, and all of a sudden I realized that I had 3 burning questions that I really wanted to ask Baba. So Monty ran into Baba, and she asked whether or not I could do this. So Baba sent word that yes, I could come in and see him and ask my 3 questions. I raced into the door, and there was Baba, and greeted him. Baba had me sit down in a chair across from him. And of course, as soon as I sat down, I couldn't remember the 3 questions. And I sat and I struggled, and he said, "Now, Charmian, just try." He said, "It will come back to you. Really try. Put your mind to it." You know? So I said, "All right, Baba." And I'd sat there, and I strained, and finally I got out one of the questions. And then finally another one came back to me. And then finally the 3rd one. And each of them Baba replied to. And so then Baba said, "Well, now if you have any more questions tomorrow, you may come right away to me and ask me the questions." Well, of course, in this day and age, in retrospect, if I had that same opportunity, I'd be burgeoning with questions in all directions, and certainly I'd be trying to ask something important. As it is, I have no idea what the questions were that I asked. I just know that he answered them, and I was quite happy about it, and I didn't keep track of what it was, which is unfortunate. But in any event, every day while we were there, I would go into Baba and I'd ask the questions. So every day, as I'd sit down, I'd forget them. And Bob would have me think, and finally they'd come up, and again I'd answer, or he'd answer them. Well, it didn't occur to me until years later that, funnily enough, this bit of asking questions had been one of my hang-ups. When I was in 7th grade, I'd had a teacher and a principal who had sat down and really lectured me up one side and down the other one day that I mustn't ask so many questions, and that if I'd just wait, answers would come to me. And they'd been very adamant about this, and that it wasn't fair asking questions ahead of the rest of the class or anything. So I'd gotten in the habit, on their instigation, of never asking a question. I'd forgotten how to. I couldn't even formulate one, really. By then I was in college, and I had spent 2 very silent years in college, never asking anybody anything. And of course, this isn't the way really to find out things. There are always things that you need to ask about for information in order to proceed in any course of action in a coherent fashion. And of course, what Baba had been doing was to get me over this. And in essence, I had learned again to ask questions and to be able to formulate one. So, and as I say, I didn't realize this until years later. I was telling somebody about this business. I think it was within the last 5 years up in Santa Rosa. I was telling them about this business of the questions, and we suddenly started talking about how difficult it was sometimes to ask the right question, to know what to ask. And I was telling them about this experience in the 7th grade, and all of a sudden it dawned on me what Baba had actually done for me. Anyhow, in going on a little bit ahead to England, Baba had had the cast removed from his leg, but as I said, they still said that Meher had to have this plastic surgery done. And finally, the last day in England, it was decided that I should drive Meher and Mani and Baba to the airport. And each day they had given me a new car, one that I hadn't seen before and really didn't know that much about, and again, here came a new car. So we got Meher in, and Baba and Mani, and all of a sudden I realized I didn't know where the starter was. And the Mandali were about to pull away in another car. So I let out a yell, and everybody ran for the Mandali, and they came back, and then somebody else yelled and ran for a blanket and covered Meher up because she wasn't supposed to see the Mandali, and the Mandali weren't supposed to see her. And they got the car going for me. We pulled out, and they had this rather peculiar arrangement of 2 main parks in London, where you went through one on a diagonal, and then you had to go across like 3 lanes of traffic on a big highway, and against the traffic, up one side of a lamppost, down the other side, still against the traffic, and again across 3 more lanes into the other park. Well, as soon as I got out in the middle of all this, trying to get around this lamppost, I was flipping directional signals and everything else, and the car started to stall, and so I tried to get into lower gear. And I struggled with the thing and struggled and struggled, and I pushed the clutch, I thought, out the other side of the engine practically, and I still couldn't get the clutch to move. And all of a sudden I hauled off and gave it one mighty heave, and the next thing I knew, there I was waving the clutch around in my hands. It had come off. And Bob was sitting in the back seat. Of course, the car sputtered to a stop, and he went in. I turned around with this, I guess, the most aghast look I've ever had on my face, feeling, well, now I've wrecked the car, we've missed the plane, I've blown the whole thing for Baba, what am I going to do? And Baba sat there. I thought he was going to really laugh out loud. He chuckled. His whole body was shaking. He was just, you could just see merriment, you know, and he snaps his fingers. Come on, Charmian, get going. Do something. To this day, when I'm driving a car, I can still hear Bob in the back seat going, come on, Charmian, go. A little bit faster. One time I asked Bob, because I'd been driving him someplace, and I said to him, I'd found a little bird had been hit by a car. It was laying by the side of the road, and I asked him, when a little bird dies like that and the car strikes it, do you take the scent scars from a little animal or bird like that? And Baba said, yes, it always goes to the driver of the car. He says, unless I'm riding in it, and then I take it. We went, in any event, going back to the trip, as I say, we went from London then down to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, I stayed for a number of days in Locarno with Haiti Mertens and Baba. And, of course, being young, I'd always heard that Baba really didn't need much sleep. In fact, slept very little at night. And somebody was always with him. And I couldn't, as I say, call me a doubting Thomas or whatever you like, but I always wanted to just see. It was just curiosity. And it just happened in Locarno that the room that Delia and I shared overlooked Baba's room from the balcony. And I know many times at night, just because I wanted to catch a glimpse of him, as well as just checking something out, which really had nothing to do with it, but I would go out on the balcony just to see if Baba was up or what was going on. And every single time, always I would see some movement in the room or something which would indicate that Baba was up. It wouldn't matter what time of the night I was out there, what was going on. And I really don't think he slept hardly at all. Always at night somebody had to be with him or guard the room. And on the rare occasion when he did sleep, it was really quite a chore trying to keep silence around. It was really something. I can only remember one occasion when I was asked to watch his room, and as a matter of fact that happened in London just before we went to Switzerland. One afternoon I decided to wash my hair, and I knew just as sure as anything that if I put my head down that basin of water and got it lathered up, I'd be called by Baba. Well, of course, Baba, being the perfect gentleman, waited until I'd rinsed the soap out at least, and then bang, 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 on the door came Delia, and I was called up to Baba's room. And I had thrown a hotel towel around my hair, sort of like a turban, and put on a Japanese banker's coat, one of these long coats with frogs down the front and a little high neck, and went running up through this very staid British family hotel up to Baba's room. Well, I got up there and they said, well, we're all having to go out to do something and you're to watch Baba's room. Baba is actually going to sleep for a few minutes, and that means there has to be absolute silence because the least sound will wake him up. I said, all right. So Baba went to sleep, everybody left, and I was left out in the hallway, and so everybody left, and Baba's door was shut, and Baba was going to sleep. And there I sat, cross-legged out in the hallway, dressed in this very funny costume. And to help me, it seemed to me that the whole of London was in there on a convention before we were through. We had drunks wandering down the hallway. We had people talking loudly coming down the hallway. And the weirdest thing was that we were way miles away from the elevator. There was no reason for anybody to wind up at that end of the hotel except us. And yet everybody and his twin brother did. And of course they were all accosted by this rather weird American lady in a strange costume running up and saying, "Shh, shh, we have somebody sleeping down the hallway and they're not feeling well." And then they'd be quiet and give me a strange look and go on their way. Well, the last word in the thing was I heard this tremendous clanking noise of like china hitting metal, and I couldn't figure out what on earth this was, and it kept getting louder and louder and louder and louder and coming closer and closer. And finally I looked down the hallway, and sure enough, out through a door, just a few doors away from Baba's bedroom, came a great big huge creaking wicker commode, and obviously a man who was grimly determined to deliver it right into Baba's room. Of course, he having been ill, they had asked for it so that he wouldn't have to go all the way down the hallway to the bathroom. And somebody had packed a china tea set without any paper or anything else in the pan to this commode. Of course, it was crashing in every direction, and I had quite an argument with him, trying to get him stopped and to be quiet. And I'm hanging on to this thing, steering it down the hallway, trying to keep him from waking Baba up. And of course, in the middle of all this, I could just hear Baba's merriment in the other room. I'm sure he wasn't asleep. He was just having a ball watching the shenanigans and my perturbation out in the hallway. But in any event, going back to Locarno, while we were there, every evening in the little house there, Baba would call us all in, and we would sit around him, and he'd ask us, for instance, to tell him stories about different saints. And of course, the minute Baba would say, "Well, tell me a joke or tell me a story about a saint," your mind would go as blank as if you'd never heard of a saint. Like, what's a saint? And pretty soon, finally, somebody would work very hard and they'd dredge up a story, tell it to him, and about some local saint or something. And when they'd get all through, Baba would listen very intently, and then he'd say, "Ah, that's very nice. Now, let's talk about real saints." And then he would take out some materials on St. Francis or St. Therese of Avila, or two of his favorites, or St. Catherine of Siena, St. Augustine. And he'd read or have read to us some stories of theirs, some of their writings. One day, I know Anita Villard and her husband came up to see Baba. And I never forgot, Anita went into the room there with him, and we were all sitting around one night when she was talking about having been in the concentration camp in Germany during World War II, and what a hard time they had had. And she was telling it very amusingly, and obviously trying to be amusing. But reading between the lines, one could see how very desperate the life had been and how very unhappy. And when she got all through, she kind of held Baba's hand for a minute, and she said, "And Baba dear, you know I'd do just anything for you, anything at all. But Baba dear, please don't make me go to jail again." And so Baba looked at her very seriously and said, "All right, Anita, just a minute. Let's see who will go to jail for Anita." And he looked around the room very carefully, and he went over each face, and everybody kind of stiffened as he looked at us. And he went back down the row again, having gone past me twice then, and then back up, and then he fixed on me, and he said, "All right, Charmian will go to jail for Anita." And I thought, far out, wow, I'll go to jail for Anita. Isn't that silly? What would I go to jail for? After all, I try and be a pretty good girl, and I don't try and violate any laws. And it was several years later that thought ran through my mind as I stood in the jailhouse in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, looking out the window, having been arrested for, and at the moment they were trying to decide whether my head was going to roll in front of the local mosque the next day. I had been arrested for crossing the border to Mecca with the air attaché who was driving the car, American air attaché. And they'd thrown both of us in jail. And I can remember looking out the window and thinking to myself, all right, Baba, I get the message, and I might have known it would be for a religious offense. So, and Baba later confirmed this. He said, well, it had to happen because these Mecca had to be opened up eventually. And of course, Baba always uses prototypes in anything that he does. After all, who's God got to work with if not his own? So he very often will use the Mandali to set up a situation and work it through. I can remember in Switzerland, just after Baba left, on that journey, Duncan and I, and I think Irene and I think maybe Rana was there still. I don't know. She may have been going back to visit some family. I don't know. It was either Rana or Kitty. And I said to them, well, you know, you all have been around Baba for so long and so close to him. What is it that you feel you've gotten from this? I mean, do you feel like you've advanced a great deal or that you're able to do things so much better or something? And I remember Duncan looking at me and saying, oh, for heaven's sakes, no. He said, you don't understand. A hammer doesn't need to know it's a hammer to strike a blow. That's in the hands of the carpenter. And I think this was very true. None of the Mandali or the people close to Baba really, who lived with him, had the feeling that they were anything special or that they were learning really anything. They were spending all their time really just trying to cope with situations as they arose and trying really to do what Baba wanted them to, just in any one situation, because he usually asked us to quote a simile, to stand up and sit down at the same time, and it left one spinning, very often turning one's wheels rather ineffectively. But this was all part of the whole pattern of the way he worked with us. In any event, going back to Locarno again, the one of the things that we did there, you remember in New York and in London, the doctor still had said that Meher needed plastic surgery. So we were very worried about this because we were afraid that there was going to be very little chance of their having proper facilities for this in India if they went back. I don't exactly know why we thought this, since plastic surgery essentially is a skill originated in India. But we were concerned about it, and Meher again went to the specialist in Switzerland, and he removed the bandages, and there she was. The forehead was well, the flap had closed and healed over, and the doctor then said she would not need the plastic surgery. So she went back over to India. We still at that time, of course, had some concern over whether or not there would be repercussions from the concussion at some time, and of course, there was great concern over keeping her well consistently, because we knew that a cold or any illness would be serious if it was a head cold, since she had fractured the sinus orbits. But it worked all right. Baba had her on, with the doctor's insistence, on penicillin, I think, from the time we had left the States. In fact, since the thing occurred. I remember one day in London, we went out to see Ham House and see Kew Gardens, and I had left the car parked a little ways away from the Ham House itself. The problem was that it started to rain while we were there, and when we came out, I had to go back to get the car, and instead of leaving Meher indoors, she came out on the porch, and it was rather cold and blustery, so she got exposed to the damp. Well, that evening I was called up to Baba's room, and I went in, and Baba was really scolding everybody and saying, how could you do this when Meher is so dear to me and you jeopardize her life this way? Let her get wet, and let her get chilled. And I kept starting to open my mouth and say, but Baba, it was all my fault. I had to go get the car. And every time I'd open my mouth, Baba would look at me, and really such a look. I wouldn't have opened my mouth for anything. Charmian, be quiet. Don't you utter one word. And this went on and on and on. The tension in the room kept building up. And finally it all resolved, and Meher went off and had her penicillin shot. And it turned out, later I found out that Baba had wanted her to take her shot, and she had refused to take it. And this was why he more or less set a whole scene up to finally get her to where she would go ahead and do this and protect herself. And I'm afraid we were all not so easy to work with as in retrospect we would like to have been. And of course, Baba always attracted strong people around him. If they weren't strong characters and very, how can I put it, very dominant characters, why, it didn't work very well for his work, because he needed that friction. He needed the energy that was produced. When an archer wants to shoot an arrow, he picks a bow which is very resistant. And it's the resistance of the wood in the bow and so on that as he pulls back and stretches it in his arms, eventually enables that arrow to go the furthest. And so Baba always picked, I think, people who perhaps were a bit, really gave him something to work on. And we used to laugh every once in a while. Somebody's ego would get away with them, and they'd begin to feel a bit upset because Baba would spend more time with this one or that one or something else. And so the answer to that was always very simple. Well, of course Baba's spending a lot of time with the people that need it. And the minute you thought of it that way, you got less ego involved. And I suppose I needed a lot of time. That was why he spent so much with me.
Could you tell us what your feeling or reaction was when you heard that Baba had a severe automobile accident? Did you have any thought that a master would not have such a thing happen to him? What was your thoughts at that time when you heard that Baba had his accident?
Well, it wouldn't have occurred to me at the time that a master wouldn't have such a thing happen to him. Obviously, Baba had. And I mean, after all, when you even look at your history in the Christian Bible, if you want to go on that basis, Christ never would have been crucified. The way the master works is such that anything can happen. When Baba went off in the new life and became man for all men to all intent and purpose, in the seeker on the path, certainly he laid himself open to all sorts of injury. Anything could have happened, because he had said that for this period he would not work as God. He would work as a human being. And at any time during the course of a master's life, these things can happen. When the Prague, Oklahoma accident occurred, and we got the telephone call, we were, of course, shocked, because it hurts those of us who love Baba deeply to have any injury come to him. You can't believe it when it happens. You know it's real, but the main thing is that always we were too busy. The Mandali and the people who were close to Baba really didn't have all that much time to sit around and be thinking of what was the explanation for this, what was the meaning for something. I can remember when I came back from Europe the first time and I was asked to talk about the trip, being absolutely startled. When I got through, I'd recounted what had happened, what we had done, and a little bit about what was said and where we'd been and the activities that we had. And somebody looked at me and said, and now, what spiritual message do you have for me? And I remember looking at them saying, well, they must be kidding. What spiritual message do I have for them? Me with a spiritual message? I mean, our life was too hectic. We were right in the middle of things, and Baba was constantly working with us in ways that didn't allow us to sit around and be thinking up spiritual messages for anybody. We were just too darn busy. Which is not to say that there certainly weren't lessons learned and things that occurred, but they were always based on very clear reality, practicing reality, being right in life and working with it. He really didn't want any of us off sitting around meditating. Even the Mandali, he would never allow them to be with him until they'd finished their daily chores, the things that they had to do just in life. This came first. The almost joke in the ashram was how many people wanted to come to Baba and to be with him and to give themselves to him, along with their wife and 12 children, and the responsibility for the support and maintenance and care for all these people. They had no idea of really giving themselves to God. Because God is in everyone, and if they wanted to give themselves to God, then the thing to do was to give themselves to their families, really, to go on with the minimal care of them, and to study and work and carry out their responsibilities in life. He never let any of us duck away from it. And it wouldn't matter, even to the least little thing had to be done before anybody had the luxury of sitting around with him. And usually, every time on a Sahavas, when somebody went to the Sahavas, that I noticed, I can remember Don Stevens one year doing it, saying, well, this time I'm going to go and just sit at Baba's feet and soak it up and be part of the Sahavas and enjoy him. And we got in, and Don left and went about his business, and I went in my direction. I didn't see him for about 2 or 3 days. All of a sudden, I looked up one day, and here came Don around the side of a building. He looked absolutely green. He had half a week's growth of beard, and he was worn out and kind of peaked. And I said, why, Don, what happened? And he said, have you ever been in charge of the luggage for 500 people and tracking all the bags down? And I said, well, so much for that comfortable Sahavas. I mean, all Baba needed to do was get a whiff of it, and as I say, he was always very aware of where our thinking was. And he'd put you to work very quickly. And he wanted his people in school and doing the things that had to be done to fit them for the world around them so that they could be of some practical use. And he wanted, he always used to say, I mean, anybody can go off and live in a cave and be good. If you don't have to face up to temptation, if you don't have to face up to what is involved in life, what is there to being good? Being good is doing it when you are surrounded by temptation. That's doing what God really wants. It's behaving in a constructive way in life every single day, even in the little things. And Baba always, when he gave us something to do for him, it was never the kind of a thing that you would think of. It was never the kind of a thing which would give one a little more ego points. Never the grand gesture, you know. Baba would say, well, you do what I tell you to. And you'd say, oh, yes, Baba, thinking he'll ask me to fling myself from the nearest cliff or conquer a tiger or do something magnificent. And I'll make this marvelous gesture and wow, won't I be something? And Baba would look at you sweetly and say, how many cigarettes do you smoke a day? And you'd say 12, and Baba would, or 2 packs or whatever, and Baba would say, well, I think you should cut it down to 6 a day. Well, of course, so Baba would say, well, cut yourself down to 6 cigarettes a day. I'll help you. Well, of course, the result of that was, number one, you didn't get your ego built up by making the grand gesture. But the other thing was, too, that every time you'd reach for a cigarette, and you'd do it a dozen times. So Baba would say, well, cut yourself down to 6 cigarettes a day. I'll help you. Well, of course, the result of that was, number one, you didn't get your ego built up by making the grand gesture. But the other thing was, too, that every time you'd reach for a cigarette, and you'd do it a dozen times or 1,000,000 times a day, and you'd have to not smoke it because it wasn't one of the 6 you were allowed, you'd think of Baba. And you'd say, well, all right, Baba. Baba doesn't want me to smoke that cigarette. And it would keep you focused on him. And even when you did smoke the cigarette, you'd be focused on him. I know he did that to me. And then one time he said, well, no, I don't want you to drink anything except you may have a couple of fingers of liquor.